Hello, I'm Richard Lindsay of the University of East London and also the Senior Research Advisor to the IUCN UK Peatland programme. I want to talk to you today about how we define peat, how we map peat, and why this matters. The biggest challenge when identifying and mapping peat is that the thing which defines peatland is hidden underground. The surface vegetation itself may give no indication as to whether this vegetation is sitting on 1 metre of peat, 10 metres of peat, or no peat at all. Indeed, what do we mean when we use the term peat? What is peat? Definitions of peat vary, but common to all definitions is that peat is dead plant matter preserved and accumulated by waterlogging. And all definitions agree when the peat is as deep as this. Where, for example, is the boundary between peat soil and heathland soil in this image? Is it indicated by the change from fawn-coloured cotton grass to the dark tone of heather? But the heather cannot be rooting in bare rock, so organic material must have accumulated sufficiently for the heather to root and grow. So, is this peat? These sphagnum-rich springs, with their underlying organic layer, are only around 10 centimetres thick and are quite distinct from the wet mineral marsh surrounding them. It's difficult to describe these springs as anything other than peatland. As such, this small piece of material taken from such areas is quite evidently peat. It is dead plant matter accumulated over time within a waterlogged environment which has prevented complete decomposition of the material. Yet, within certain other contexts, all these examples would fail to be defined as peat. Definitions and classification systems are always devised for a purpose, and after World War II, the UK economy was in terrible shape, so natural resources capable of being economically exploited were a high priority. As this 2014 Scottish Natural Heritage Report summarises, the Scottish Peat Committee was established in the late 1940s to, amongst other things, identify areas suitable for commercial peat extraction. Peat less than 50 centimetres deep was deemed unsuitable for this purpose, so the definition of peat in Scotland came to be applied only to those areas considered exploitable, i.e. greater than 50 centimetres deep. This definition was subsequently adopted by what became the Soil Survey of Scotland, and has remained so right up to the present day, with the 2023 Wildlife Management and Muirburn Scotland Act making rotational burning on peat more than 50 centimetres deep illegal because it is damaging. One is left to assume that rotational burning on peat which is only 40 centimetres deep is somehow not damaging. The post-war focus on soils in England and Wales was directed more to agricultural potential than suitability for peat extraction. The result was that the Soil Survey of England and Wales in effect used the plough as the yardstick, setting the definition of peat as 40 centimetres or more, as we can see in the present Land IS definitions for peat soil types, because this reflected typical ploughing depths. This definition is also used today by DEFRA to prevent damage from rotational burning on peat within protected sites. Peat, which is only 30 centimetres deep within protected sites, is, one must assume, regarded as somehow immune to the effects of burning. The key consequences of the currently used definitions for peat in the UK is that peat, which is shallower than 40 or 50 centimetres, becomes invisible, and the consequences of such invisibility become very considerable indeed. Definitions matter because they can radically change both the scope and the scale of an issue. Here we can see the range of estimates for the extent of UK peat published during the course of the last 40 years. The blue dots indicate that estimates of deep peat, i.e. more than 40 to 50 centimetres, have varied between 1.5 million hectares and double that at 3 million hectares. Add in peaty soils, or shallow peat, which are the orange dots, and the estimates more than double, rising to more than 7 million hectares. Spatially, we can see the effect of adding shallow peat into the UK peatland inventory, with green and pink shading more than doubling the extent of peat soils. But as long as the official definition of peat remains at 40 to 50 centimetres, these additional areas are invisible to land use policy, funding support instruments, and restoration action. In contrast, what is the approach of our continental neighbours to peat and peat soils? This is now the de facto Bible for peatlands throughout the continent of Europe, providing descriptions of peatlands for all 49 nations of Europe. Of these 49 nations, 17 don't use a depth threshold at all, while 26 of the remaining 32 use a threshold of 30 centimetres or less, including Russia. The focus is instead on whether an organic rich layer, no matter the thickness, has accumulated because of waterlogging. The majority of European nations would thus have no problem in defining this as a peatland, whereas in the UK it would be invisible to policymakers concerned with peat. If the present UK definitions were to change, what then might replace them? How might we define and recognise peat? The most obvious criterion would be that there is evident accumulation of dead plant matter resulting from waterlogging of the material, rather than because conditions are simply acidic and nutrient poor, as is found on dry heaths. If the plant material is highly decomposed, so plant fragments are not obvious, the black colour of the soil is instead a clear indicator, because no other soil takes on this hue apart from some heathlands. Ground truth can quickly distinguish between well-drained heathland and waterlogged peat. This black hue can often be discerned using remote sensing at certain times of the year. In this case, the ploughed peat soil fields of Königsmoor in Germany stand out from the surrounding landscape. A further source of potential information consists of the Environment Agency flood risk maps, in particular combining the river and coast flood maps with surface flooding maps and using the longest flood return cycle. We've found that this combination of maps can be extremely helpful in identifying likely peatland areas, particularly in the lowlands. Why is it important that we have a better grasp of the UK's peat resource? Reluctant though I am to focus on a single ecosystem service, because I believe that this leads to distorted outcomes, there's no getting away from the fact that carbon storage is one, and just one, of the key services provided by peatlands, and to a much greater extent than for any other habitat. If we look at the typical carbon stored across the world's soils, histosols, i.e. peat, stand out as the predominant means of carbon storage. If we take average figures for sphagnum peat, herbaceous peat and decomposed peat from Julie Loysal's extensive peatland database, using bulk density, organic matter content and carbon content, we can feed this into a neat piece of code written by Jack Cook of Aberystwyth University to calculate the amount of carbon stored within a hectare for a given depth of peat. We can then compare this with published figures for tropical rainforest. Sphagnum-ridge peat is the least carbon dense, but even here, for a depth of only 30 centimetres, at 90 tonnes of carbon per hectare, we are already equaling or exceeding some of the lowest carbon values for tropical rainforest. If instead we consider just 30 centimetres of highly humified peat, a condition often typical of shallower peat, we can see that at 240 tonnes of carbon per hectare, we are holding more carbon than the majority of documented tropical rainforest carbon. For carbon alone, shallow peat is our tropical rainforest, yet it remains invisible to those who hold its fate in their hands, simply because a definition makes it so. I've been told that it would be too difficult both to map this resource and then to embrace it within policy decision making. So we look the other way. We turn a blind eye to it. Yet the most famous occasion of turning a blind eye was when Admiral Nelson put a telescope to his blind eye when reading a flag message from the Admiral of the fleet, calling all ships to turn away from the Danish fleet because the dangers were seen to be too great. Nelson ignored this message, chose to face the difficulties head on, and won the famous Battle of Copenhagen. As John F. Kennedy once said, we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Thank you.